wokeism is not anti-American. It's actually as American as apple pie. In fact, I think some of the worst aspects of woke politics that have spread to the left come from America. It came from America to France rather than from France to America or from Germany to America. It's actually, if you really look at someone on the right who understands this very well, there's a guy named Paul Gottfried. I think he's one of the most sharpest minds on the conservative. He's a scholar, so that's part of why. But Gottfried actually has this great book called The Strange Death of Marxism, where he identifies the death of Marxism, and he actually thinks, guys, what has replaced Marxism is worse. And he thinks that James Lindsay and Peterson have it backwards, that actually there's an Americanization of politics that spreads to France. Now, how does wokeism come to America? Well, America is the capitalist power of the world. When there is a shift in the capitalist economy globally, America is at the center of that. And that, when there's a shift in the economy, there's a shift in ideology. Well, in America, you have a couple things going on. Move to from producer to consumer economy, and to what we call neoliberalism. And throughout that, what facilitated neoliberalism was the decline of class politics.
Hello, academic. Or sorry, wow, I was about to do the intro. You got the fucking academic insurance thing in my head.
Yeah, now you're primed.
Jesus. Okay. Hello, Plastic Pills listeners. Today we're looking at what some might see like a strange mutation in the culture war, what people are calling the so-called woke right. I don't think it was coined, but it was popularized by James Lindsay. So the term claims that parts of the new right, especially within MAGA and post-liberal circles, are beginning to mirror the very woke politics they claim to oppose. According to him and others, they're kind of talking about victimhood narratives, purity spirals, online mobs, and a heavy reliance on a kind of identity politics, but just flipped for a different team. So we looked at 4 pieces that we'll have in the show notes. One is like The Rise of the Woke Right by John Stossel in Reason magazine, which is like a libertarian magazine. We looked at Is There a Woke Right by C.J. Engel in The American Reformer, which I understand to be like a pretty radical right-wing rag online. Then we had How the Woke Right Replaced the Woke Left by Thomas Chatterton Williams in The Atlantic. And then finally, The Woke Right is a Useless Term by James Antill III. I love it when people have the third in their name. In The American Conservative. I feel like that's so
distinguished.
It's such an appropriate name to have writing for The American Conservative, James Antill III. Anyway, so I guess the question is the woke right a meaningful label? Or is it just a rhetorical move, I guess, used to discredit some rising voices in the post-liberal right? And to talk about all this is someone that I think is one of, I think maybe my favorite voices, especially when it comes to political theory online. I was actually mentioning to Eric just before that, I have a few, I don't want to say a lot of friends, but I have at least a few friends with podcasts. And I would say that very few of them do I actually listen to their podcasts, but I do listen to Tony from One Dime Radio and the One Dime YouTube channel. So I will also have a link to his podcast and YouTube channel in the show notes. I recommend it. It's just Tony talking to different interesting people, usually political theory topics, but also broadly political topics, I'd say. And I always just find them super informative. So welcome, Tony. Thanks for coming on the Pill Pod.
Hell yes, second time around now. I think came around a year ago.
Welcome back.
And I had Victor on my pod as well.
Yep.
Not too long ago.
You can find me ranting about sortition. But anyway, so I guess maybe we'll give you the first a first shot at this, Tony. Like, what do you think about this? Obviously, it's silly, like in some ways, but I mean, what do you think about this term woke right?
Yeah, have you caught it? It's been around for a couple months, I guess.
I've been saying there's a woke right for a while. I just don't think those articles were very good at describing what it is. James Lindsay is somewhat onto something. I don't think James Lindsay is as stupid as some say he is.
Yeah.
In that he's pointing to something. I just don't think he always tries to bring it to Marxism. And I find that so weird. I actually think Marxism is the antithesis of woke politics. There is a kind of woke Marxism, but I think Marxism is the antithesis of woke politics. But I won't like give this my whole spiel of what I think wokeism and right-wing wokeism is, because that will take a while. But like, I mean, first, maybe I guess your guys' thoughts, like if we're going to talk about right-wing wokeism, how are we defining woke? Like, what is wokeism?
That's a good question. And I know that Eric was thinking about this when we were initially talking about doing this episode. I have no idea if you ended up thinking this through or not, Eric, but I know that you were thinking about its semiologic, or at least just thinking about the term, the etymology of the term woke, right? It obviously originally came from like Black activist movements. I don't know. Do you still have thoughts about that, Eric?
Oh, right. Yeah. Because the last couple of weeks we were reading Derrida's White Mythology, which is basically about, this metaphor and the metaphorical basis, like language is metaphorical top to bottom. And the way that words kind of start out having almost like a common sense literal meaning to acquiring another meaning where they're used metaphorically, like their meaning is transferred to something else. And there's an implicit comparison then between those two things. Like, calling a man a pig, right? Like just, not literal, it's metaphor. Okay. And then, but if you use the metaphors enough, they lose their original literal meaning and they become, like concepts, like in metaphysics. That's kind of the argument he was evoking and criticizing, is that like progression towards concepts that are not metaphorical whatsoever when really they are. And I looked at woke like that. Woke is a verb that has become a noun. It is a action that people do, awakening to, first from sleep, that's the literal meaning, and then it becomes a kind of intellectual awakening, kind of going back to the Enlightenment. But, as words do, they become kind of rigid and categorical, So to be goes from a verb to a category, being. Thinking goes from a thing you do to like a category, thought, a static category. Same with woke. Woke goes from like an intellectual awakening to being a category of people. The woke. It's now a noun. It's now used as a noun. It's a category. And it apparently is just describes this type of person. And now apparently it's growing to take in people on the right as well. Now people on the right can also be woke. And that was the line that I was pursuing. Actually, really, that's about as far as I got with it. I mean, because Derrida's argument is very difficult and it's hard to just plug terms into it.
And I definitely don't want to rehash. I don't want to rehash Derrida. In fact, I was looking forward to this episode as being a breath of fresh air from fucking having to read Derrida. But not that this is exactly that this is the freshest air, but. I think that's like a kind of a useful way to start, because it obviously started off as one thing and then it became like a descriptor and then it became a pejorative description, right? It became a certain constellation. And like, at least the way that it seems like Lindsay is talking about it here is certainly something that to some extent I've noticed for a long time. I guess a certain constellation of behaviors of silencing opposition, right? Some sort of victimhood narrative, some sort of like a very rigid us versus them. And I think he's just saying that there's a similar pattern going on, which is also something I would say that I've been saying for a long time, that like the more you, and I think we've talked about it on this podcast also through like psychoanalytic terms, like in Lacanian terms, that, canceling or these other behaviors on the grounds that they're being victimized by some hegemonic group. Well, then the people who are being accused of doing that can risk becoming the mirror image of the thing that the other's accusing them of. And I've always thought that like there's always a risk that they can become mirror images of each other. And I think in a way that's what James Lindsay is trying to identify here. And I think one of the interesting things that James Lindsay, I guess it surprised me as well. I mean, that's like maybe a different conversation, but because I just assumed that James Lindsay was totally like mega cult.
He's a classical liberal. So he's always claimed to be like this sort of enlightened centrist, neither far right or far left. I think he would be more of a Democrat, really, like a Bidenist. Something like Destiny, in fact.
Yeah.
I would say Destiny with less Adderall. I mean, the guy has a PhD. He's not like completely incompetent. Yeah, I mean, that demonstrates a level of competence. He might not know what he's talking about when he talks about Marxism.
Yeah,
But like,
for sure.
he's not a guy who doesn't think about things. I will say though, what Eric was getting at with wokeism, the semiological approach is the exact approach I take to kind of understanding wokeism. So I have an article, if anyone wants to check it out. It's on Patreon, but I won't keep it there because I only have it on Patreon because I wanted to get initial thoughts.
Okay.
But right now it's an article that just presents the hypothesis, which is that, I really attempt to define what wokeism just like is. If I were to pinpoint a definition, wokeism is a style of politics that presupposes that the awakening of a correct consciousness is the prerequisite to political solidarity. So like the basis of that politics succeeding is contingent on others being awakened. It's not this approach of, making compromises with different people, forming alliances. No, it's about people awakening. You have to have the right beliefs, the right etiquette. It's almost anti-political, which is why I call it anti-political politics, because politics, etymologically, is about the polis, which is people coming together, and making decisions on behalf of a community, what is best for a community. You think of like woke politics, it's very antithetical to that. Woke politics is all about, do you have the correct views? And I tie the origin of woke politics to the first and second Great Awakenings, and particularly, the rise of evangelicalism. And so that, we mentioned, semiology, the importance of it. I really wanted to look at like, woke, because everyone likes to only go to the etymology of its popularization in America with the Black community. And with that, it's Marcus Garvey, actually, who kind of heavily popularizes the word saying stay woke, but it gets more popular with like this song, and then it gets popular in the 90s is when it really takes off, when it's like stay woke became a thing among Black communities that then later got, kind of, you could say, co-opted by, people outside of that, and it snowballed into a million different things. But I do think people have a sense of what like a woke style of politics is, because a lot of people do use it as nothing other than a disguise to attack progressivism. They might actually like oppose, civil rights politics. They might oppose, even just progressive politics from a conservative point. But I think like, there's an intuitive reaction to woke politics that's not the same for just progressive politics in general. And people have trouble defining it, but they'll say kind of intuitively, they're like woke. And, the woke right, what I think Lindsay does correctly is he associates sort of groupthink. Yeah. He associates dogmatism. And, one example that I gave in my sort of like hypothesis of all this is actually the satanic panic is sort of, another example of right-wing wokeism.
Mm-hmm. That's a good example. I've thought about that before too.
My position on the term itself, like woke, in the pejorative way it's been used since, say, like the 2010s, is that it is, it's a term that originates on the right, and it's meant as a pejorative term for certain tendencies among the left that the right view as extreme or radical. So I don't think it is really a term meant to describe anything. It's one of those labels, right? And it's like woke. It's nice. It's quick. It's one syllable, right? It beats social justice warrior. It beats cultural Marxism. Like all those terms, which are roughly synonymous for what woke is. Woke is just this catchy, quick term that can be used to dismiss leftist ideas. So James Lindsay is trying to come up with this new category or expand the woke category to the right by accusing people like Tucker Carlson of being a right-wing version of woke, right? Or like the Christian nationalist.
Do they say that about Tucker?
Yeah.
He did say that about Tucker, yeah.
He says that Tucker Carlson may be like the arch wokest on the right? Or something like that.
Maybe a little bit.
And James Lindsay also calls it woke fascism. He actually uses woke fascism as a synonym for his term.
Yeah, instead of woke Marxism, there's woke fascism.
He's onto something there, but I don't know in the way he thinks he is.
Well, you have to look at it from two ways. You have to look at it from who is Lindsay trying to call woke on the right, and what is their response to being called woke, right? So you can go look at Tucker Carlson's response. It's quick, it's dismissive. How can you be woke and on the right? Makes no sense, blah, blah, blah. But like Lindsay is trying to describe two things with this term that he's trying to describe the radical far right as woke because they're, again, a mirror of the left. Wokeness on the left being very obsessed with identity and race and gender. There's a mirror of that where on the radical right, they're very focused on whiteness and males and being victimized. You know, who is a more persecuted group in America than white Christian males, right? Oh, that's so woke of you to be so focused on your fucking identity. And all the categories are there: religion, gender, and race, right? White, male, Christian. Yeah, that's woke. That's right-wing identity politics. These are points that Mac McManus made way back with postmodern conservatism. That conservatism tends to mirror arguments that the left has made, you know? And James Lindsay even brings this up in his discussion. He talks about legitimacy by paralogy, which is a term he got from reading Lyotard's Postmodern Condition. He says what wokeness boils down to, one of the ways you can boil it down is to legitimacy by paralogy, which is like coming up with new moves in the language games, right? Like Lyotard was very into Wittgenstein's later work, and he took up the idea of language games but for him, yeah, wokeness is like a kind of that kind of thing. Like you identify truth with power. You reduce everything to language games, and you can just, whatever, throw in anybody else now. Foucault does this, right? Performative contradiction man.
Well, that I find funny, because to me, actually, Foucault, I really dislike Foucault, but I don't think Foucault is a woke example of woke politics at all.
Oh, yeah, this is all simplification. This is the narrative he's presenting.
I don't think any of the postmodern thinkers are really woke.
It's just that woke people do bastardize Foucauldianism, though, to make their arguments.
Yeah, you know, anybody who tries to do what Derrida does inevitably does a worse version of Derrida. Anyone who tries to do Foucault inevitably does a worse version, because you're not fucking Foucault, right? Was it like, I want to paint like Picasso. How do I do that? Well, you can't, because you're not fucking Picasso.
It's not that they're trying to be Foucault. It's that they use the tools that they think Foucault gave them to analyze society. And I think maybe misunderstand what he was saying, but I don't know if
I still think like all that postmodern Frankfurt School, like that completely misses what I think. Like that gets us off what wokeism is.
Yeah, that's all the framework for like wokeism in general. And what Lindsay is saying is that people on the right, who he's calling the woke right, are sort of starting to mirror these things that the left is doing. And their version of wokeness is to be focused on, you know, white male victimhood. And the other aspect of it, other than the far right, is the Christian nationalist right. So the anti-war people, the anti-war MAGA people, remember how like before Iran was bombed by the United States, there was a big split in the MAGA movement, because originally one of the pillars of MAGA was end the forever wars, no more wars. And then now Trump is going to bomb Iran, and he does, and then afterwards MAGA's completely on board.
That's not true, though. I don't know. I hear a lot of leftists say that. Like, I've paid a lot of attention to the MAGA people are very divided over that.
I agree.
I think they're dumb. I think they're dumb forever thinking he was going to get them out of war, but they definitely, a lot of them did believe that. Like a lot of them.
Well, this is why Tucker Carlson, surprisingly, is getting called the like arch woke person on the right, is because him and Steve Bannon and all of them have explicitly come out as against the Iran war.
Yeah, but I don't know if is that really why they're called woke though. Like I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah, because if you're not for,
I don't think Bannon's woke. I think Christian nationalism is an example of woke, but you know, I can get into why.
I want your reaction, though, Eric, to the definition that Tony put on the table, because I feel like his definition gets to something that I think is crucial, which is like the kind of dogmatism. And I like that you call it anti-political. Like, I think that's like a good insight. Like, because what you're saying woke is, what it's getting at is, it seems to me that like when you're awake to some truth, that's a truth that if you're not accepting, like you're kind of dead to us. It is reading between the lines is sort of like the implication of your definition.
It's consciousness-based politics fundamentally.
And it's like if you're not on it, and it's like anyone who disagrees with us like isn't worth anything. And that is anti-political, because political is like about like disagreement. It's about people coming together and having like legitimacy. And I think like I agree with you. I actually really like that definition, because I think like that is in a way what can mark what people object to on the left. It's like, yeah, there are obviously, like, Eric is right in the sense that there are obviously like opportunists that use the term woke as a weapon to just delegitimize all left ideas. Obviously that happens. But that doesn't mean that there's not like a real quarter of the left that has been conducting politics in this very dogmatic way in the definition that Tony put forward. And now I think what Lindsay and others, I guess, like, are trying to identify is like that same pattern of kind of dogmatism. Like, if you're not up on the truth, like, you know, you should be canceled. Like, all that stuff is connected, I think, to this sort of like have access to the real truth. And if you don't have, if you're not willing to accept it, then like you're not really worth engaging with. And I'm just curious, Eric, like what you think about that.
I like the overall idea that there's a kind of anti-politics that woke is trying to describe. But what was confusing when I started looking into what the woke right is, and what I'm still a little bit confused about, but I feel like I have a bit more handle on, is the term is fundamentally incoherent. It is trying to do different things, and it means different things in different mouths, right? So you have Lindsay, who is a centrist Republican classical liberal, just like Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson, also a classical liberal, and he's not really a Christian, as we're all now learning. He flirts with Christian ideas, but he's kind of a nihilist. He's in that sort of camp who's going to be where this term is originating from, James Lindsay. And who are they trying to put it on? They're trying to put it on people like Tucker Carlson, like Candace Owens. They even brought up Mitt Romney for kind of being sympathetic to the BLM movement. They bring in a bunch of different people, right? And so that's why I think it's fundamentally incoherent. Like, it's a pejorative term, first of all. So it's being used to try to criticize parts of the right that are maybe going out of line. And so when James Lindsay calls Carlson woke, he says they're not real conservatives. They're liberals that have mistaken themselves for conservatives. James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson are liberals, he says. They're not true conservatives. Whereas Lindsay says, no, these woke right people aren't true conservatives. They fell. What James Lindsay thinks.
Lindsay is a liberal. Like, he calls himself that, like a classical liberal. He's like a Dave Rubin type of guy, you know? Except Dave Rubin now is a sort of Trumpist. Dave Rubin's a Trumpist.
And Dave Rubin
now
is actually an idiot, too. Like, way more of an idiot, I would say, than James Lindsay.
Oh, yes.
I don't even know how to locate them on the political spectrum. But, like, James Lindsay's story is, like, after World War II, right, you have this rise of neoconservatism, Bill Buckley. And they marginalize all the quote unquote true conservatives, and they become the central hegemonic voice on the right is this neoconservative group, right? Who for him, I guess, are kind of at the roots of wokeness on the right, because they're super interventionist.
Is that what Lindsay says? Well, it seemed to me like actually Lindsay supported the marginalization of the radical movements. That's kind of like what he likes about the old conservatism.
Well, yeah, maybe, because the neocons, I guess so.
Neocons are conservative liberals. That's
liberal conservatives. Yeah, he kind of described them as liberal conservatives. They marginalize the true conservatives, who are like the paleo conservatives.
Yeah, paleo conservatives, Christian nationalists.
So, and those groups, which, I don't know, this is why it's so hard to figure out, because I think the term is a bit incoherent. It's like one of those, what do we call them on the left? Contested terms,
floating
right?
signifiers.
Yeah, they're floating. It's right now. It hasn't been nailed down. It hasn't had its moment of like that point de capital.
Yeah, no, it definitely has not.
It's contested. It's floating around. They're hurling it at each other. Mm-hmm. You know, the classical liberals are calling the far right people that, and the far right people are calling them woke, and like it's just going around. It has no basic agreed upon meaning at the moment, but it does have this sort of trend towards, you know, people who are, say, against bombing Iran become woke right because they don't think that that they're anti-Semitic. Right?
Has anybody
That's
actually
the
said that,
basic-
though? I haven't heard anybody bring up foreign policy with regard to woke. Maybe that's a recent development. I don't know, Tony. What do you think of all that?
I picked up these things in my blitz of looking into it the past
Okay.
couple of days. So I could be wrong. I could be getting my wires crossed a bit on some of these things, but that's the general vicinity that I've found this term to be.
Because I don't know that Lindsay would be excited about. I mean, I sound like I'm fucking defending James Lindsay, and I'm not. He's kind of a nutcase as well, like in his own weird way. But sorry, Tony, I want to get your reaction to what Eric has been talking about.
If you allow me, I can give him what I think is a genealogy of wokeism on the left,
Please.
and broadly on the right. I just want to say, so out of all the books I've come across on wokeness, the best one by far has been Musa Al-Gharbi's We Have Never Been Woke. But I still think it definitionally doesn't nail it down as enough. Because, yeah, you're right. Like, people just throw around this term to describe stuff they don't like, frankly. They're very ideological in how they apply that term. However, I think it applies to something, because if you notice, even the way it's applied by the left, it's not necessarily applied by the right to the left. It's not applied to everyone on the left. Bernie Sanders is not usually called woke.
I've never heard him called woke.
When you say woke, you don't think of Bernie Sanders, even though Bernie Sanders, so, he's not against rights for black people, LGBT people, or anything like that. He's not a Christian nationalist. He's not a conservative. He's a progressive to the left of a lot of those woke people, right? So it's not extremism either. It's definitely a style of politics.
Yes.
So the etymology here, I want to go back to this word awakening, because why do I center evangelicalism at the origin of wokeism? Evangelical Christianity is profoundly different from the rest of Christianity, not just Catholicism, but other Protestantisms, in that for evangelicals, they believe that what is most important is not even like the practices, it's the belief in Jesus. Belief is the most important thing for the evangelicals. Not only that, you have to come to that belief yourself. You have to be awakened. This is why, a synonym often for evangelicals is being a born-again Christian, because you have to come to that conclusion yourself. It's not enough to just simply be born into it, go to church, do what you're supposed to do. No, you have to come to that correct conclusion yourself. There is a real belief in, a superiority in those who come willingly to the truth of Jesus Christ. And this is something that's actually very uniquely American. I mean, evangelicalism spread much outside America since then, but America and the democratization of Christianity played a large role in this. And it's this is kind of what's interesting to me is wokeism is not anti-American. It's actually as American as apple pie. In fact, I think some of the worst aspects of woke politics that have spread to the left come from America, not these foreign countries. If you look at some of the worst politics that have spread in the left, it came from America to France rather than from France to America or from Germany to America. It's actually, if you really look at someone on the right who understands this very well, there's a guy named Paul Gottfried. I think he's one of the most sharpest minds on the conservative. He's a scholar, so that's part of why, but I don't agree with him ideologically. He's a paleo-conservative. But Gottfried actually has this great book called The Strange Death of Marxism, where he identifies the death of Marxism, and he actually thinks, guys, what has replaced Marxism is worse. And he thinks that James Lindsay and Peterson have it backwards, that actually the kind of new left that's, emerged, its tendencies kind of come from America. And that there's an Americanization of politics that spreads to France. Now, how does wokeism come to America? Well, America is the capitalist power of the world. When there is a shift in the capitalist economy globally, America is at the center of that culturally. And if you're a Marxist, you kind of see, I'm not a doctrinaire Marxist, but I do take a materialist framework to a lot of these things. And that, when there's a shift in the economy, there's a shift in ideology. And in America, you have a couple things going on, move to from producer to consumer economy, and to what we call neoliberalism. And throughout that, what facilitated neoliberalism was the decline of class politics for a lot of reasons, the failure of communism, failure of Soviet Union, but also the crackdown on unions, the sheer crackdown on unions, globalization that allowed for jobs to be shipped everywhere. You just have a huge decline in class politics. Now, what do you get out of that? You get, at the kind of moment when you start having a gradual decline of class politics, an emergence of consciousness-raising politics. This is kind of, what people associate with the 60s left. And this is where a lot of people like Gabriel Rockhill, who are left critics of this sort of thing, get kind of wrong. They think that this caused the decline of class politics, that cultural
Western
politics.
Marxism.
Yeah, Western Marxism. That Western Marxism, distracted us from real Marxism. But what they get wrong is actually like the decline of Marxism is what caused the rise of the cultural politics, not the other way around. And like this kind of, because there was a real lack of class politics, but you also have real problems in society. What do you get out of that? So you kind of get, race politics changes. The way civil rights activism changed in the 70s is actually really interesting to see, because you go from a kind of attempt at a politics of emancipation. You see this with Martin Luther King, right? That ultimately believes in a universality of humankind. It's a very universal. So it's almost like post-racial, right? You start getting the rise of like black nationalism. Now, I'm not one of these people who thinks black nationalism is equally bad as white nationalism or anything in terms of effects. It's ridiculous. But black nationalism is very wokeist in that, believing in the idea of a black nation presupposes that there is a shared essence, a shared consciousness, or shared possible consciousness among black people. It's actually kind of the mirror of racism. The idea of having a shared whiteness, a white culture, it's totally illusory. Because if at the level of material reality, white people are, completely different in like Finland and Russia and England. I mean, just as different as people, like far more different than like black and white Americans are. Not to mention Africans, right? Tell an African person you're black. They'll be like, well, what do you mean? It's like, they'll say like, talk about a black nation to an African person. They'll look at you like you're crazy because African countries are so different from one another, and African people internally so divided, so different groups. I mean, at the level of material reality, you see that this woke politics is illusory, but that's the thing about woke politics. It's about consciousness first. It's ultimately about the idea of being a people with a shared sense of consciousness have this solidarity together. You get this as a result of the decline of class politics. So it's not like engineered by the CIA or whatever. They didn't have to do that. I mean, yes, there is like Congress of Cultural Freedom and stuff like that. But like, I don't think that was necessary. That might have just aided what was already happening. And like, an interesting case in woke politics is the evolution of Malcolm X. Malcolm X is somebody who I would say very much embodied for most of his life, at least ever since, was in prison, got out of prison and was an activist. He kind of embodied, I would say, like black wokeism, but he actually kind of firmly turned against it. It's part of when he realizes the Nation of Islam is a cult, that this form of politics, that is the idea that, black people need to just go their separate way and, adopt a separate religion. And, being Islam, it's just not the good basis of political solidarity to actually change anything. And he actually regrets some of his comments he said about, white people not being able to join the cause. Because there's that famous scene where, it's depicted in the movie, but he talked about it in real life, where a white girl asks, what can I do? And she's like, white people can just stay out. And, again, it's very like kind of, and, there's also within this sort of community a very against race mixing. You get this sort of dodgy stuff, but, he kind of, unfortunately, he was assassinated before you could really see his thought evolve. But I mean, he very much turned kind of against that towards the end of his life. I would also say, the Black Panthers were a Marxist politics that were not wokist politics. But when you get the decline of the Panthers due to a complex set of reasons, what replaces the Panthers is actually like black nationalist groups like the Black Liberation Army. And, you could say even today that what is the Black Panther Party officially, it's, against race mixing. It's, very essentialized idea of what black people are. And, so this is race woke politics, but there's actually a Marxist woke politics too. And this might surprise people. Under Stalin, you get actually kind of the origin of standpoint epistemology, which is one of the things that people associate with wokeism. Standpoint epistemology, this idea that your position racially, in terms of gender and even class, it like determines your worldview. And of course, there's some truth in that, but like it determines, right? It gives you an authority on truth. That's interesting. But like the way in which class politics was used in Stalin's USSR was to kind of, it was ultimately a veil to persecute people, but it would often say, there was this idea of like proletarian consciousness and a bourgeois consciousness. If you look at what like Marx thought, that's not like the way he thought of it. But there was this idea of like, the idea of class consciousness got very much bastardized to mean that if you're working class, that's the only way you can have the correct perspective. And if you're like a kulak, for example, you just can't really like be taken seriously as to what you have to say about it.
Well, that was kind of, wasn't that nascently there in like the Hegel master-slave dialectic a little bit? That like, that's like that idea, right? That like the slave has insight that the master doesn't have.
Well, that's what I was going to bring up. I'll not take it back to Hegel, but at least say, you know, class consciousness is something Marx talks about and sees as fundamental to the emergence of communism is, you know, the working class becoming conscious of its economic position within the totality. I mean, you just can't do without that.
Right.
And this is where all the ideology studies
could have
stuff comes
class
from.
consciousness?
Well, peasants in Russia were a different thing, right? He's obviously got that letter to Zasulich later in his life and how he thought that
it's
was...
class consciousness, not peasant consciousness. That's very important. But why does he just
working class?
Why does he
like
center the
industrial
workers?
Working class.
It's because of their real material power. It's not because of like class figuring out that they're oppressed. The way in which class consciousness gets used later on is to this idea that like you have a perspective because of that. But for Marx, it's like it's the reality that actually matters, the objective reality. So like workers, it's not just a matter of like figuring out we're oppressed. It's because they could actually do something in the way that peasants couldn't. You know, like they can actually organize. Whereas that's why
But then the reason that I would think that, well, we were looking at Wilhelm Reich and the early sort of ideology studies people, and you could include the Frankfurt School too. The reason they turned to ideology as trying to explain why, you know, the revolution wasn't happening. How are these wars? How's the 20th century so unenlightened in terms of these wars, right? When there's massive like worker unrest and all the workers seem to be abandoning or not reaching class consciousness and instead allying themselves with like the fascists or the bourgeois. And they're looking at these questions like, why is this happening, right? And they turn to ideology. They say you can't just explain this with material conditions. You need to think about the subjective element of history too, which is consciousness. And that's an important part. Yeah, sure. So it originates with like Hegel too, right? With the subject-object dialectic. And I mean, you could trace this complicated history.
But like ideology not divorced from material conditions. Like in the case of Marcuse, he's often understood as a guy who thinks people are just like brainwashed or whatever. But like, for him, the whole basis of the one-dimensional society is the fact that capitalism really does deliver the goods. I mean, he says that like over and over, that the reason why this works, the reason why people are able to buy into the system is because they buy into the system. I mean, they do get like cheap commodities. So like the ideology, that's part of it. So it's like, I think the Frankfurt School are truer to Marx's view in that they actually like, they look at the superstructure and base in a kind of dialectic as opposed to something that is, you know,
like vulgar Marxism,
like economic vulgar. Yeah. They're not vulgar Marxists. I think they're really Marxists in that respect.
Yeah. I also think, I mean, I don't know, like at least the way James Lindsay tells the story, like complementing what you were saying. I liked what you were saying about sort of flipping around Gabriel Rockhill's kind of narrative, saying it's actually like the decline of Marxism that opened the way towards kind of identity politics, whatever. I don't like using the term wokeism because I think it's fundamentally pejorative and dismissive, but
that's the episode we're doing, Eric.
Call it whatever the hell you want. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Attention to issues other than class, like the 60s, whatever. Yeah. He says, you know, we discussed this earlier. The rise of neoconservatism, he says, marginalized woke fascism, right? Woke fascism saw itself as the check on the left, on the radical elements of the left. And he says when neoconservatism rose in the 60s, 70s with like Bill Buckley and people like that, which we've done a bit of we did a few episodes on this earlier, actually. From his perspective, they marginalized the woke right, the woke fascists.
That is true.
Right? And so these
you know who destroyed the KKK? The FBI.
Oh,
yeah.
A lot of people don't remember that.
Well, when
I mean, it didn't get obliterated, but that like KKK was far bigger than it was like today. Today, it's like an insignificant force.
Well, yeah, I did know that the FBI did a lot of like undercover operations where they had people in all the KKK cells and kind of disrupted. I don't know how they just dismantled it, but I knew that.
So the way Tucker Carlson reacted to being called woke right was to say, well, they're neocons, and neocons were originally on the left anyway. Weren't they all Trotskyists to begin with? Weren't they American Trotskyists to begin with? Which isn't fucking true at all. But that's the narrative on the right, is that the neoconservatives used to be Trotskyists and Marxist-Leninists and part of the American Marxist parties in the early 20th century. And then they had this disillusionment and went over to the right. And now we can say they're not really right because they weren't right from the beginning. I don't know. That's the cope anyway on Tucker Carlson's part. And the cope, I mean, a lot of them are just to say, the other cope with it is to say, well, the Christian nationalists will say, well, we're not woke because woke is fundamentally like a leftist term, and we're not on the left, we're on the right, so we can't be woke.
And then the right left is like the woke is a rightist term.
Yeah, which I
think buys into the narrative. It's a mirror. I think it's neither left or right.
Ironically, it's a term that originates on the right to hurl at the left as a pejorative label. And then it has another very different history before that within like the black movements, black liberation movements and stuff like that as well. But it evolved into this very pejorative term.
I think we should also be very careful in saying that, though, because this is the narrative I always heard, and when I looked into it, I was like, wait a minute. This is a common defense of like wokeism, is that this idea that it originated with black liberation movements, but it's actually a very specific kind of black liberation movements. It's not like just black politics in general. I mean, one of the first people to really use the term woke, stay woke, is actually Garvey. And if you know like what Garvey's politics were, they're completely insane. I mean, Marcus Garvey is often like, it's easy to because there people like black nationalist iconography, the flags, I understand it. But black nationalism is ironically a very American-centric thing. It's never really been taken seriously in the third world, in actual African countries. Because Garvey had this idea of like uniting black people under like a common state. Really, I mean, he really thought like African Americans had more in common with black people in Africa, and that's like, I'm literally unironically believing in racism. I mean, because the sociologically it's total rubbish. I mean, like the idea that like black Americans are far more in common with white Americans than they are like somewhere with a completely different language, completely different religion. I mean, there's this great moment of Floyd Mayweather when he's asked on an interview, the famous boxer. This is a great moment where he was asked, how does it feel to be the first African-American person with like $500 million or whatever, or some question like this. And he said, well, let's stop using this word black African-American, man. I'm American. What makes me different from my opponent today? Like, I'm American. Stop using this. And I actually kind of like this. Because, like, if we're to actually move beyond racism, the best way to get rid of racism is to stop reifying race. I really think that.
Also, what you said reminds me of that great scene in The Sopranos. I don't know. I often think about that scene. I don't know if you're a fan, Tony, if you watched The Sopranos, but maybe it was before your time. I'm not sure, but
I have friends who do, and it's too long for me to start, but I would like to.
It's a great show. There's just like a moment where like you can feel the Italian Americans sort of like reifying Italian culture, and they kind of have this fantasy, and they have like someone who came over from Naples who's working for them, and they're like talking about how they want to celebrate Columbus Day parade because he's like a great Italian, and like the actual Italian guy is like, I fucking hate Columbus because he's from the North, and he's like, the fucking North are always fucking over the South, and they're all like confused, and they're like,
have you seen the TV show Dear White People?
No, I haven't actually.
I still don't really know if it's parody or not, because to me it seems like a parody of wokeism. If it's not, that's really bad. But I think it's a parody of wokeism and its contradictions. The language of stay woke is explicitly used by the characters.
Yeah.
but it's, you see the contradictions of that politics play out in the show. It's very brilliant. But
But
the
you
thing
know,
about
it's
saying,
interesting.
I'm sympathetic to the aims. That's why I want to like not do this thing where you're equating like pro-black activists and like white nationalists. It's very different.
I was actually about to say, like, it's useful for me. Maybe it's useful to like resituate ourselves to thinking about it as like, is it convincing to think of it as like more of a style of politics than a content of politics, right? Because the content, because obviously we're going to be like more sympathetic to like all the like left woke content in a certain sense, but then we can still be like kind of disturbed, or at least in disagreement with the style, right? Which is this kind of like dogmatism, this kind of like rigid insider outsider, this kind of essentialism, which sometimes it can be strategic essentialism, which I don't agree with, you know, this sort of strategic essentialism of Spivak, but like, yeah, but I don't know, Eric, what do you think?
Oh, I was just on that last point. I just thought it was funny that James Lindsay defines woke in general as like an epistemology.
Oh,
And he defined it. I wrote down his wording. He said it was a preference for knowledges from outside of the hegemonic truth
that
regime.
was weird. Yeah,
That's
weird.
what woke. That's what he says woke is. So
you're a dissenter. You're just a dissident.
yeah, like, oh yeah, that clearly identified him as like a centrist, right of center person, right? Because he applies this label to the
That's
far
how he defines it?
right and the whole left. He said it's a preference for knowledge from outside of the dominant truth regime. So he thinks
But that's like the
ideas
definition.
like rewriting history, revisionism is a woke move that right-wing people are now starting to do. Victimhood, right? Putting the white person as the victim of structural oppression, right? Is woke right for him. Digging up the past of people to cancel them. For him, that is woke move. Bald-faced lies to people, like, well, I don't know who you always accuse people you disagree with of just lying through their teeth, whatever, but that's what he says. Lying is woke, right? Like of course
That's why
it
I said
is.
those articles are pretty bad, but I don't recall him actually like defining it.
Well, this is him. He's using so where this term is coming from is James Lindsay is going on this podcast called Trigonometry, and he is trying to launch his concept from there. So I watched a bunch of their content, trying to get their fucking definitions and what the goddamn hell does this term mean, and what are they doing with it, and who is it being applied to? And I wrote down names of the people they brought up. They describe as woke right, and like that's where I got the name Tucker Carlson from. And this is why Tucker Carlson dismisses it and calls the neocons fake conservatives, because they were liberals originally, he says, right? And it's being applied as part of the contest within the right over bombing Iran, right? If you're against it, you're anti-Semitic and therefore woke. If you're for it, you are obsessed with whiteness and pretending that Jewishness is a form of whiteness and that whiteness is victimized by structural oppression. So you're woke, right? So it means opposite things. It is a contradictory concept at the moment. Maybe a dominant meaning will come out and it will start to be used in a very concerted and coherent way. But right now, the term is fundamentally incoherent. Woke fascism, woke right.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I agree. I think we can spend all day kind of attacking, you know, these sort of low-hanging fruits. But like, if we want to get into like what is right-wing wokeism, okay, I think a very easy litmus test to tell if someone like falls under the kind of category of a woke style politics, you know, the word wake up, awakening, frequently shows up in their language. I mean, it's really not that hard to spot. Look at Richard Spencer's advertisement. It was around like the Charlottesville time, like 2016-15. There's this advertisement he produced, which was like trying to scare people about the white genocide, right? And, you know, at the end of it, which was like, wait, it's time to wake up. And it was like this,
or red pill.
Red pill, yeah, red pill is a very good example. You know, wake up to the fact that men are actually being totally like, you know, enslaved by whatever. You know, it's just okay. But the thing about red pill is I view it as like more consciously a cultural phenomenon.
It's a bit narrower,
right? But that is a style of woke politics because it's about waking up. But really, it's a problem. It's only really a problem. Woke politics is only a problem, and then a problem is only when it prevents you from doing something you want to do. It's something that is an obstacle. So if you're a right winger, why is wokeism a problem? If you're a left winger, why is wokeism a problem? I think, okay, if we were to look at examples of right wing politics, one of them is, white nationalism, race-based politics, which presupposes a kind of consciousness among white people. I mean, it's kind of what the race and IQ debate's about at the end of the day. It's trying to divide people along these lines and, what they're capable of intellectually and stuff. And you look at Christian nationalism, which I think is really the origin of wokeism, as I mentioned, because it's very specific type. It's this idea that it's not like, oh, anyone can just join the club or you're born into the club. No, it's like you come to this yourself. And that's why there's a kind of zealotry in the evangelical movement that's unparalleled in other Christian movements. It's something also very powerful. I mean, they have strengths. It's actually, I won't say it's always a liability. It's a liability politically because with that kind of politics, if you believe that the only way you have the correct idea is if you become awakened to this set of views. It's why evangelicalism doesn't really win politically, even though it does have an influence. But no president gets elected being an evangelical zealot. And if they do, they have to really compromise their own ideas. Even the most who used to be the evangelicals' favorite president, Ronald Reagan, did a lot of things they didn't like. I mean, I think no fault divorce, but
I think I read about that. Something like that. There's a bunch of stuff that happened under his administration.
Progressive things happened under Reagan that they did not want. Black Supreme Court justice, you get that too. I don't know if they would be against that actually, because the Christian nationalist isn't always very racial.
No, racist. No.
Yeah. Well, sometimes,
but I beg to differ on that point. Because
sometimes I think Tucker Carlson is a racist, but that's
I do too. But I just let me quickly, Eric. I kind of want to ask you though, because I feel like you're kind of doing this thing. Maybe you can correct it where you're okay, this concept's incoherent, and it's sort of a bit of a hand wavy move, to kind of be well, this doesn't matter. But I just think
I'm not saying it doesn't matter. I'm not saying it doesn't matter.
Okay. Because there's a bunch of concepts that are incoherent, but they're having quite substantive effects on society. I'm not sure that, I do think that wokeness or accusations of wokeness and the fact that it is pointing to some style that people recognize where I think that it was a reason why Trump won, at least in part. I think that they were, and a lot of that is just right-wing propagandists, but a lot of it is because they were able to point to real behaviors, real styles of politics, to kind of use the way that Tony situates it, that people found objectionable, and were well, I don't want to vote for those people who are for whatever canceling or silencing
Good
or
example.
Are looking at. Yeah,
I have a great example. I remember when people tried to say AOC was woke, but Bernie wasn't, and then woke people would say that's a racist or sexist claim. A good example why that's not the case is you rarely Zohan Mamdani, who just won mayor of New York. Actually, the woke label wasn't generally applied to him. I'm sure there's some right wingers out there who say that, but from what I've seen about the right, they just kind of call him they just say racist shit about him,
or they just call him a Marxist.
They think he's a socialist and they're freaking out right now.
Right. But that's the kind of thing Bernie is not was never really associated with being woke. I mean, some people say that he played into the woke in 2020, but he's never accused of being a woke guy. Biden wasn't accused of being woke in the way that Kamala was. Right. Kamala, because she played into the kind of language games more. Biden's too old for that. He's just before any of this. He just doesn't understand it. He'll say that, the thing about woke politics, right? I'll give you a good example. The way we talk about minorities. A lot of woke people have this certain way of talking about minorities that totally backfires and does not benefit the minorities they seek to represent. Tolerance versus acceptance. In a liberal society, it is in line with liberal principles for people to have basic rights to do what they want to do. And I think most trans people, for example, that's all they really want. They want to be left in peace. They don't want to be discriminated based on who they are. They don't want to be denied a basic humanity, basic opportunities that other people are, right? That other people have. The problem with the idea of acceptance is acceptance implies changing other people's views to not only be okay with that, but to actually like believe in that. So this is where you get like transgenderism as a debate versus trans rights. And I'm not like saying, I'm not going to give a view as to like what I think of transgenderism, but the thing about it is why it's different. When we talk about things like transphobia, it's interesting to me because some people say, oh, like we equate transphobia, racism, and sexism. Like transphobia is now used as a slur that's like as bad as being a racist. But what did the civil, the matter is like, policing people to not have these views. But what did the civil rights movement actually do? It implemented laws that made it, illegal to discriminate against Black people. I mean, that is like the most you can really do. You can try, slowly to change. You can surely try. You can maybe also, again, maybe not just have Black people play the funny Black guy in media and actually be, play normal roles like other people. But if you try to like in a very forced way, which is what people have issue with DEI, change culture by changing people's ideology. And even worse, though, is if you actually police people out of a movement for not harboring that ideology, that's kind of woke politics because that presupposes having the right ideas. Whereas you can be like, I think for society to work, right, the civil rights movement was like, civil rights movement didn't end racism. It ended like really bad systemic racism. You could argue as to whether that's fully ended, but like it definitely ended it more than, like to a large extent, undeniably. Patriarchy is very important in today's day and age as a discourse because the way we talk about it's weird and it ties into woke stuff. Woke people who try to push like anti-patriarchal stuff, it's all about erasing patriarchal attitudes, which involves policing people's thought, which is where you get the connection between woke politics, cancel culture, political correctness. That's the connection right there. It's that through line. What it actually matters when it comes to patriarchy, it's not whether people have sexist views, it's whether there's a structural power dependence that women have on men. That's what patriarchy was usually in a scholarly way defined as. It's real dependence on men, therefore a subordinated class. Whether you have patriarchal views doesn't matter insofar as whether the woman actually, is subordinated by the man. So like this is what kind of the issue when you try to police people for their views, it has a reaction to it. So I think red pill is a reaction to left wokeism, and you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I wanted to say like in agreement that actually I think recently Sarah McBride, who's like the first openly trans member of Congress, was on what's his name's Ezra Klein's podcast, and she made a very similar argument to what you just said, which is like her diagnosis is, when gay marriage happened, it was like kind of easier to make that argument because all we were saying was like, let gay people get married. It doesn't really affect you. But when trans politics came in, it's like meaning like the progressive movement got overconfident because we were like, look how much we won with gay marriage. And now we can smash this like trans rights thing. But then they like went beyond just like legal stuff. They started policing people and saying like you have to, like, for example, the pronoun stuff, right? Like people are like, oh, don't complain, it's not a big deal. But it's like, okay, now like I have to not only tolerate, right, I have to like accept, and then I have to start using your language. And in a way, like this kind of like enforcement of language was a thing. Now, so I agree. I think that's like a good analysis, and I think like that is what happened. But then now the question to me is like, is something analogous to this happening on the right? Are we seeing like similar levels of policing of language? Maybe it hasn't been long enough. But another good point that Sarah McBride made on that episode was like that she thinks that now in a way that overconfidence is maybe happening on the right, where like the same overconfidence that the left had, it's like we're winning all the culture war stuff. Now we can just start like changing culture at the granular societal level and we'll just keep winning. But it's like they push too hard. And she's like, well, maybe that's going to happen now on the right, that they think they're winning so much that they're going to start pushing for these sorts of cultural changes. Maybe like the Israel-Palestine thing is an example, but maybe they're going to start pushing too hard on like porn or something like that, right? They're going to start like making porn illegal or other kinds of I mean, I guess that would be like a legal change, though. That wouldn't be like trying to enforce societal behaviors. But I guess like, because you frame it, Tony, as about like the beliefs, like kind of policing beliefs, and that's definitely like a part of it. But then what was kind of interesting was like that on like the woke left, it was actually like policing behaviors, right? It was like, say your preferred pronouns, right? And it's like, and in a way they're like, we don't like, hopefully by forcing you to do that or socially pressuring you, or like land acknowledgements is another one, right? Which happens in academia at least, and it's starting to happen in other places. It's like, it doesn't really matter if you like believe like the it's just like enforcing that, normalizing that behavior as like kind of a, almost like an etiquette, a form of etiquette or politeness that you ought to do those things. But are we seeing those similar things on the right, I guess?
I think, though, I want to address a comment that someone probably is going to be typing right as you're saying that, which is, who cares? Are these real problems? And I'll say why you should care. See, I'll be honest with you. I don't give a damn, really, like about the pronoun stuff. Personally, like I'll call people what they want to be called. I don't care.
Oh, I'll call people what they want to be called, but I'm not going to say my preferred pronouns are he, him.
Yeah, well, I also find it kind of unnecessary, right? Like, but it's the kind of thing, like all these are, I find them, but I want to say why it does matter. It matters actually, ironically, for people, those groups, the progressives, because how do you want, like, do you want, think about it, you should measure the success of your politics based on, does it actually like lead to better outcomes? And woke politics is a total failure. Do you know what I mean? Like on that ground, like it's kind of, what has happened to trans rights has actually been rolled back in America. Yeah. I mean, I remember not too long ago, I mean, I'm not that old, but like I'm pretty young. And the thing is, I even remember when trans stuff was not politicized. Like, I remember, like, trans was the kind of thing where it's like, oh, they exist, some people do that, but it's not like like a huge deal. It's like, whatever, those people, some people, they might be considered weird on the fringe. But when people started getting pissed off, and yes, you could say it's drummed up by the right, but you have to assume a massive, colossal level of stupidity on people to think that, like, people who are propagandists can just create an issue out of thin air. I mean, propagandists capitalize on people's existing resentments, So, like, I think what people got pissed off with the trans question is that not only are you asking them to accept trans people, which I think is a very sensible obligation, it's to accept the idea of what justifies being trans, which is transgenderism, which is the idea of like, actually, our ideas of men and women are wrong. Gender is fluid. Now, I actually think we should question, I think gender is complicated, but do I assume we have the correct idea that we can go and impose on people? I actually don't think we do. If you look closely at these things within the gender stuff, like even like Lacanians have a completely different theory. The
it's at least very clearly a contested arena of like,
we should allow it.
Yeah.
We should allow it to be contested rather than being like, say this is the correct way to think about it. Like, and
actually in the Supreme Court case recently, that I don't know, the decision hasn't come out yet, but it's like about books that children have in schools in the US. And I remember one of the examples was like, it was kind of like a book teaching children, like, I think under 6th grade. I forget what grade. And it would kind of be like, oh, like, doctors, you have a children, and then doctors kind of, they see you and then they take a guess about what your gender is. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. And like, I don't know. When I read that, I was like, wow, that's like, I mean, that's a pretty controversial way of framing it to children, I would say, that they're just like taking a guess.
But there's also a material basis to all this stuff. And I think this is the most important thing. There's a material basis to this kind of politics, ironically, even though it's a non-material politics. But like in the sense of wokeness, right? Why does, are these people who are having this style of politics on the left, at least, because that's if we care about that more, as people who tend to be left-leaning, why are they just stupid? Or is there a real reason why they do this? And I think the part of the reason why is because a lot of what makes up the left are legitimately like people who are either in the professional managerial class or PMC aspirants, meaning that they aspire to be part of the professional managerial class, but are actually, economically working class, but they adopt the sort of etiquette and sociological makeup of someone in that strata, and as a result, they kind of, in the case of the people who are comfortable enough to not really care about the bread and butter issues, they genuinely do want to commit themselves to a cause, but they don't care that much about the bread and butter issues. So they want to pick and choose these other issues. It's also a lot easier for capitalism, isn't it, for a progressive movement to exist that talks about all these issues that don't threaten capital than it is to ones that do.
And we've definitely talked about that before.
Yeah, of course. And then I'm far, many people pointed this out, but it's like,
yeah.
There's people who genuinely do care. It's not just woke people are stupid. I saw that a lot of us saw this in the Bernie stuff. I remember it was always fascinating to encounter when you would see like a student who supported like someone like Pete Buttigieg over Bernie or Liz Warren over Bernie. And I always thought, like, why? Like all the things you seem to like about this candidate, you like Bernie does, but better. But it's because they would care about a specific issue like more than, the common majority issues. Like, for example, if you're a Buttigieg person, you would go hard on the LGBT, stuff. With Liz Warren, you'd usually be a woman. I mean, like, ultimately, that's what it boiled down to. Like, but I noticed with class people, with people who are, legitimately, like, really struggling, I mean, Bernie resonated the most. And I don't want to say, but that's not always the case, but it's more likely to be the case. So when you see these woke divisions, it's not just like the people are stupid. A lot of the times why woke politics exists is because you have people who are not working class who want to commit themselves to a kind of cause. And they do so this way because it's also easy. There's a whole activism industry. Like, why actually like think too hard about these things when you can just work for an NGO and like do DEI and you're helping the world that way, right?
But then my question, though, and actually maybe, I don't know, I know, Eric, you haven't said something in a little bit. I'm curious what you think, but I want to get back to like the right-wing version, right? So like, is there something analogous happening on the right? Like, I think on the kind of basic style of politics point, I think, we do see, and obviously, like, I think the one obvious thing that we should say as well is like, I think all of us are probably at least somewhat pleased, or at least amused by the fact that this is leading to some kind of right-wing infighting, right? That like they're pointing fingers at each other, calling each other woke. But is it correct to say like Tony, you were talking about this whole industry, but I don't know, is there like a woke right industry? I mean, I guess in a way maybe there is on like YouTube, right?
There is, and I don't think it's actually grown, it's died. So okay. I think right-wing wokeism has already died in the same way that left-wing wokeism has been dying, in that it became a circular bubble that policed anyone, who didn't fit the box out, and became so marginal and became more extreme as it got more marginal and got more extreme. It's a feedback loop. Good example is the Christian nationalist movement. You see that, the Christian movement, particular evangelical movement, as it gets more marginalized, it got more extreme, and as it got more extreme, it got more marginal. There's a whole industry of like Christian podcasts that I wasn't aware of. And when I was became aware of it, I thought, interesting, like I've never been shown this. It's like a whole other universe. And it's like, sometimes when I talk about certain things to people who are not like, that political, they're like, I have to check myself because I'm like, that I'm in a leftist bubble, because like it's really easy to get into these niches, but the right-wing wokeism, yeah, I think it marginalized itself. I mean, the race one, it's very obvious to see why that would marginalize itself in today's day and age. I mean, there's the funny thing about like, I saw this meme that was actually differentiating left and right wokeism, but it was kind of like a meme, but it got edited truth. It was showing like left wokeism. It's like, you're a transphobe, or you're a, this, you're a that. And on the right, it's like, you're a Jew. Like, it's just like racism, anti-Semitism. I mean, That's definitely a thing with parts of it. But, when I first made this connection between the evangelicals, and I think this was fascinating because when I was trying to search as to see if like there was this connection that was made between evangelical Christianity, I'm still looking. It's why I haven't completed the full thing. But there's actually this book by a Christian right-winger, moderate Christian right-winger, and her book is called Awake But Not Woke. Oh. And in it, what's very interesting is she tries to define like wokeism in all the kind of typical ways a right-winger often does. But she says like, yeah, she calls it like a fake religion, and that it's a fake religion. And but the problem isn't that it's a false awakening. And what we need, though, is the real awakening.
Yeah.
Christ. And I thought it was interesting because that's like an endorsement of right-wing wokeism very explicitly there. Whereas what I would say is like, how do you actually change shit? It's people who have the interest to change shit, forming an alliances to get with each other to change shit.
Yeah.
Different classes of people who have a basis of, common interests to do stuff. That's what would make sense.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection. But Eric, I don't know. Do you have any kind of final thoughts or reactions?
Yeah, I was listening the whole time because I was trying to figure out whether it is we disagree or whether we're just talking about completely different things. Because you guys presumably consider yourselves to be on the left, and yet you take up this woke term like at face value, like it actually describes something that's happening on the left, and it's not just a rhetorically.
I don't think that's face value. I don't think that's just face value.
Well, you said I was. Well, hang on. You said I was hand waving the term away by thinking of it in purely rhetorical terms, which it is. It's a rhetorical term. It's not describing it's not an objective description of something that's happening in the world. And we're sort of confusing, again, like woke as it's been used since 2010, as it was appropriated by the right and used as a bludgeon to hit the left with. And then like we pass by that point, we accept it, and then we suddenly just shift right back into talking about woke as if it describes something on the left.
That's what I've been trying to show this whole time, is that there's actually a consistency in woke politics.
Well, that's why I just kind of jokingly question the leftist credentials, because I think, like, why would you want to do the right a favor by giving this term
I don't do the right a favor. I think there's right-wing wokeism.
Like, I think hand waving it isn't an appropriate. I'm not trying to hand wave it. I'm like, this is a dangerous ideological term that should be like, decried as a rhetorical strategy. And I think what we were saying earlier as like, now why is woke right important? I don't think it's a coincidence that this giant chasm opens up very briefly on the right over like, Trump and forever wars in Iran, that the term then returns home all of a sudden, just at the moment that big divisions are emerging on the right.
I think you're on the wrong side of the zeitgeist here, buddy. I have to say, I think I've never seen more in my life people who are late to the party all dropping woke like flies. I mean, you see it everywhere. It's funny, like stuff that I was seeing in like post-left discourses, and I wouldn't say I'm like a post-leftist fully, but it's like stuff that I was seeing in post-left areas or like dirtbag left areas, as it was called. Now it's just become like the norm in left spaces to accept. Like you see now like big Joshua Sortorella is popping off. That's kind of, he embodies that sort of, changing view. I mean, even AOC has dropped a lot of that kind of language.
She got rid of her pronouns in her Twitter profile.
Yeah, but even like, look at how she talks. She doesn't do she used to do these very annoying things where she would like always like be so scoldy. She's almost become like, she's taken some of the criticism, and I think it's good. I think the people who are critiquing the left from the left were good.
Why is that? Why is pointing that out helping the right? I mean, isn't it helping ourselves to be like, let's stop doing these things that are losing us elections? Like,
no,
I think, or helping the other side.
I think taking the term woke at kind of face value, which is what's the problem. Like when I try to be critical of a term like woke, I try to look at how it's being used, which is why I trudged through a whole bunch of like James Lindsay and Christian National. Like I wanted to see how it was being used, who it was being applied to, and how those people on the right, woke right, were reacting to the term and pushing back against it. And to me, that's like, you don't need to dignify it with a 150-year history of conceptual evolution. Like it's a term, James Lindsay came up with it like 7 months ago.
Do you think that my definition of woke dignified their version of woke? I think the whole thing is it shows what it actually is, and it kind of disrupts the Lindsay idea.
And I think it's very helpful.
Lindsay thinks wokeism is extremism, or just like anything that is outside of the norm. What I have to say about that has nothing to do with it. The whole, like Victor, you got it when you said it's more of a style of politics than a content of politics.
Well, that's what I was trying to focus on is how James Lindsay was sort of using this term woke right. And, you know, I guess my earlier stated belief about wokeism in general is that, you know, the post-2010 pejorative sense of the term. I find that history very helpful. I don't know the history of the term woke before it kind of came into the media sphere. And, you know, my own experience with it is being at university and having universities being called bastions of wokeism, and then looking around and just seeing this extremely neoliberal institution with a very conservative people running it, like battering down Palestine protests. And then I'm like, okay, how is this place woke? Like, it makes no sense.
It's because you're in the university. Actually, this is what I've noticed. It wasn't until
I was on the inside while people were saying that, going, this is not right. What they're saying about what's happening at university is patently false.
Well, look, but what program did you do in university?
Woke 101, baby.
And you also almost got canceled, Eric. I mean, we don't have to tell that story, but like you did, like you literally did for something super stupid. Like you were a victim of it too.
And that really opened my eyes a bit to what does happen on the left. And I think your story does capture, you know, there are definitely very excessive tendencies on the left. And I became aware of them, but then I look over.
And it was nothing serious, by the way. If we don't edit this part out, I just want to make it clear for the listeners, like this was not like anything bad. It was literally just him asking a question of someone who was in his department lounge and being like, hey, like, are you supposed to be here? And then the person was like, oh my God, they're not letting people of color like into this lounge. And it was total bullshit.
Well, yeah, it's good content.
I want to like give the opportunity, maybe just a minute to kind of like wrap it in a bow here. But like, I don't know, like it seems like there's broad agreement, but I'm not but is there? Like, is there broad agreement here?
Well, that's what I was trying to identify, because I have a hard way of saying I don't take the term seriously, but I do. Yeah,
you like
maybe,
stopped halfway.
Maybe.
You were analyzing it, and I think you were onto something, but then you stopped, and you were like, you dug and you saw the contradictions, but then you stopped at the contradictions. Whereas what would Hegel do? Hegel, you get at the contradictions. That's how you get at the truth. You get at the truth of the matter through the contradictions.
That's why I'm waiting. But Hegel knew that, you know, the owl of Minerva flies at dusk, right? We have to wait to see how this all shakes out. And that's why I was saying right now it's a contested term. We're going to see where woke rightism lands. What group? Is it going to be the Christian nationalists who the term finally kind of sits on? Or is it going to be these centrist people, right? Like James Lindsay. Are they going to have the term actually pushed back onto them? Which force is going to prevail? Because right now, I think woke right, it has different contradictory meanings. You're pro-war with Iran and defending Israel, or anti-war with Iran and defend. I've seen these things. You know, I watched the Christian National podcast, and it also can mean, you know, are you obsessed with like white male victimhood? Or does it mean something else other than that? Like, there's a few different like meanings competing for dominance under what woke right means. That's my point. And we do, yes, Hegelian, it's a dialectic. We have to wait and see. We can't just run ahead of the dialectic to see where it's going to land. We just have to wait and see.
Well, I do think that Tony offered a pretty plausible account of like the landscape so far of like how we can understand it,
and the history does help you tell where things might go. It does help like that, and I found his explanation to be helpful. Especially, I liked the way he turns the tables on Gabriel Rockhill and the kind of that's one of those Marxist-Leninist lines of argument about Western Marxism, etc. But yeah.
Anyway, Tony, final thought, because I do have to go. So why don't we get? Do you have any last remarks?
You know, this article where I first articulated the ideas, it's called Defining Wokeism, Yes, Really. And like I want to put it out on a kind of magazine of some sorts, and I've thought of different ones, but I also am trying to think carefully because I don't want to put it on a magazine where leftists who are already skeptical of that magazine are going to click off.
Oh,
So
yeah.
I'm still like not sure, and I'm still in the process of whenever it comes to putting out my own theories, I spend a lot of time before I like write it, like put it out. You know, like the
Maybe you
furnished.
should just Substack it.
I might just do that, yeah. But it'd make for a good video essay too.
Well, if Tony decides to make it available, it'll be in the show notes. We'll find out if he decides to make it available. If not, maybe it won't be. But if not, stay tuned for it.
I think one of the things that helped come to that conclusion is the videos I did on the Cultural Revolution.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, which I recommend. Some of my best work is that.
cool.
But that's an example of left wokeism, the Red Guards.
I think we talked about that a while back, didn't we?
We did talk about that.
Yeah,
So
I'd say
great.
everyone should go check it out, and the article.
everyone should also check out Tony's podcast. Consistently good stuff on there. Interesting people. If you want to get an insight to a lot of issues relevant to those who are interested in theory and political issues generally. Thanks for coming on, Tony, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Sure.
All right.
Till next time.